My name is Fae Weichsel. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an IATSE Local 600 member, the International Cinematographers Guild, where I work as a rank and file first assistant cameraperson, also known as a focus pooler. I am also a National Executive Board member with Local 600 and the co-chair and the co-founder of the Young Workers of the Eastern region.
My name's Jessica Gonzalez. I am a lead technical test analyst at a video game studio. I have a pretty long history of working in games, probably about a decade in quality assurance, and started at Activision, kind of went around from a few like AAA studios, so like Treyarch, Blizzard, and tried indie. So I've kind of been all over the place with that, but definitely wanted to stay in games and software development. I am a founder of A Better ABK, which is Activision-Blizzard-King Workers Alliance, which is a group of former and current employees at Activision-Blizzard-King who are like working together for change. It's like a collective effort of, rank and file workers who are trying to change the industry for the better, because there's obviously a lot of like, it's kind of seen as like a frat boy culture or like a boys club, right? So there's definitely a lot of initiative to move away from that kind of stuff. And so that's what a lot of the work that I did with A Better ABK was. And that's on Twitter at A Better ABK. And also am one of the organizers for GWA, which is the Game Workers Alliance, under a smaller branch of ABK, which is Raven Software. The quality assurance workers there unionize, actually, which is pretty great, and are still trying to get the employer to the bargaining table, but not for lack of trying. And yeah, that's a little bit about my like professional background. My organizer background really started when I was kind of like thrown into a leadership position of, organizing ABK under the lawsuit that happened where the state of California sued Activision-Blizzard-King for widespread sexual harassment and discrimination, which, is a thing in the industry that is just plaguing the industry. I mean, I'm sure you saw with Riot Games had a very similar, they actually just recently settled. So it's still ongoing, the lawsuit. And frankly, like the organizing effort is still ongoing. There's definitely a huge push to, make ethical video games.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor and made possible by the support of listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, so if you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and definitely go check out all the other great shows in our network. And please support the work that we're doing here at Working People so we can keep growing and keep bringing y'all important conversations every week. You can support us by leaving positive reviews of the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can share these episodes on your social media and share them with your coworkers, your friends, and family members. And of course, the single best thing you can do to support our work is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. And if you subscribe for $10 a month, you'll also get a print subscription to the amazing In These Times magazine delivered to your mailbox every month. So if you haven't already done so, please head on over to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you'll immediately get access to all of the great bonus episodes that we've published over the past 6 seasons of the show. We've been putting some real bangers up there on the Patreon feed of late, and you guys definitely don't want to miss the other great bonus episodes that we've got coming. And thank you so much to everyone who's already a subscriber on Patreon. It's because of you guys that we are able to keep doing the show every week. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and I am so incredibly grateful to our incredible guests for joining me today on our annual Pride-themed episode of Working People. Of course, the struggles that we are going to be talking about today do not just exist for 1 month out of the year. The fight for the rights of our LGBTQ plus coworkers and neighbors and family members is never ending and non-negotiable. And we need to be there for one another every day of the year. And that, sadly, is getting truer and truer with every passing day because, you know, we hosted this episode last year with, we had a conversation with the incredible Gabby Pierce, as well as Martha Gravatt, retired UAW member. And even then, we were talking about how dark things were getting in the country. And if you're listening to this, I imagine it is no surprise to you that things have only continued to get darker and scarier and more violent and more intense. And so our fight, you know, the fight to stand up for and stand up with our LGBTQ fellow workers and our neighbors, you know, we really need to do everything that we possibly can to stop and fight back against the increasingly fascistic attacks from the far right. I mean, you know, as we speak here in late June of 2023, we are seeing mobs of angry and violent far-right protesters showing up outside of school boards, showing up outside of schools themselves, and even getting in brawls with, you know, Pride, like people just, you know, trying to enjoy the month of Pride or, you know, trying to celebrate, you know, LGBTQ history, and, you know, they're being attacked for it. And that's not even, you know, mentioning the just relentless onslaught of anti-LGBTQ, especially anti-trans legislation that is coming through state houses across the country. That's not even mentioning the, you know, just high octane and vicious and hateful rhetoric coming from, you know, elected officials all the way up to, you know, basically every candidate running for president in the Republican field, right? I mean, this is becoming, like, in many ways, it already has become the anti-LGBTQ vitriol, the hatred, the genocidal violence that we're seeing people express around the country. Like, this is really becoming the tip of the spear of a large, dangerous, deadly fascist force in this country. And if you are a cis, straight person thinking that this is all just going to fade away and pass us by, that it's a fad or what have you, whatever justification you're using to keep your mouth shut and stay on the sidelines while our neighbors and coworkers are being attacked, I implore you to reconsider, because this far right contingent, they are not going to stop what they're doing unless they are stopped. And we need to be the ones to do that. And so today, as with our episode last year, as we will continue to do in future seasons, we want to bring together some more incredible folks onto the show to have the kind of conversation that, you know, we do best here on this show, to bring together our fellow workers across industries, across the U.S., to talk about their lives, their work, their experience, to talk about what we as a labor movement are doing or should be doing and can be doing better to stand up for LGBTQ rights for working people. So what is the state of that fight within the labor movement itself? And also, we want to and need to talk about what role the labor movement needs to be playing in the larger fight against these fascist attacks and the larger fight for LGBTQ plus liberation. And so that is what we're here to discuss on today's episode. And as I said, I am incredibly grateful to be able to have this conversation with our amazing guests, the great Fae Weichsel and Jessica Gonzalez. Now, I want to just give a little note to folks listening to this that, Fae and Jessica are incredibly busy, and there's a lot going on in the country right now. So we weren't able to get everyone on the same call to have a sort of back and forth panel discussion. So when you hear this episode, it's going to sound like we're all on the same call, but actually we are going to be recording separately, but I'm going to be asking all of our incredible guests the same questions, so it'll fit together nicely in a full episode. But I just wanted to be upfront about that. I also just wanted to, before I kind of toss things over to our guests, again, if I want to make sure that everyone listening to this really understands the stakes of what we're talking about here, I wanted to also point out something that really caught my eye earlier this month. I'm sure a lot of you saw it as well. But the Human Rights Campaign, for the first time in its history, announced a state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans. And I wanted to read just a little snippet from the Human Rights Campaign's president, Kelly Robinson, where she wrote about, why the HRC declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans in 2023. And so Kelly writes, and we'll link to this in the show notes, quote, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. For the first time in HRC's nearly half-century history, we're declaring a national state of emergency for LGBTQ plus people in the United States. During this legislative session, there have been over 525 state bills introduced that attack the LGBTQ plus community, and over 220 of those target the transgender community. As of press time, more than 70 of those have become law. These laws are fueled by an anti-LGBTQ plus Republican establishment and coordinated, well-funded extremist groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, and the Family Policy Alliance, insisting on trying to control our families and our lives. Just look at what's playing out in Texas and Tennessee and Florida. These states are banning educators from talking about LGBTQ plus issues and teaching Black history, and are banning gender-affirming care and abortion care. These same states do nothing to ensure the freedom of children to be safe from gun violence, and do nothing to protect the freedom of democracy when Black and trans voices are silenced in state legislatures. Or look at Governor Ron DeSantis, who has weaponized his position as a lawmaker to target LGBTQ plus families, Black and brown Floridians, immigrants, and private businesses. Even with the majority of Floridians forcefully opposing his anti-LGBTQ plus laws, and despite surging support for LGBTQ plus families nationally, DeSantis has been crisscrossing the country to attack our community. This report details the political attacks like those he's waged on our community that have transpired in state houses across the country," end quote. And so again, we will link to that report from the Human Rights Campaign, along with many other resources for you all to get up to speed on the state of the attacks against our LGBTQ siblings. But I really wanted to make sure that I read that in the introduction, so that again, we don't want to just spend, a Pride Month talking about how awful everything is, but we, need to understand where we are as a country and where these, horrific attacks are, and in order to better know what we can do to fight them. So without further ado, I want to shut up on my end and turn things over to our amazing panelists. And we won't be able to kind of do the full sweeping sort of backstory conversation that we like to have with our guests here on the show, where I get to sit down and chat to workers and talk to them about their lives and their winding paths to being the people that they are, doing the kind of work that they do. But I was hoping my great panelists would humor me a little bit, and we could start by doing maybe a shortened version of that. And if we could go around the table and have y'all, just introduce yourself a bit more to the working people listeners and tell us a bit about your backstory, how you came to do the kind of work that you do now, what that work entails, and what your experience as an LGBTQ plus worker in the American workforce in the 21st century has been like, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. So, Faye, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I started, like I said before, I work as a first AC, also known as a focus puller. And I did go to school for filmmaking. I went to the University of the Arts, and from there, then I eventually got a job at a camera rental house in New York City. From there, then I took the union test, joined Local 600, and I started my career. And then over the years, worked my way up through being a camera PA to then being a loader, then being a second AC, and to now a first AC. But in terms of like the union activism that I do and the union organizing, that came out of me. One, I came from a union household. My mother is a public school teacher and my father is a Teamster mechanic. So unions were something that, like, they weren't a thing that we were talked around the table, but it was just sort of always in the background. It was pretty funny. I didn't actually realize I came from a union household until I went to IATSE ran this leadership conference once, and they were like, raise your hand if you come from a union household, did your parents ever be in a union, and all that sort of stuff. And I was politically active, during the Bush years in high school, all the things that people use, the Iraq war protests, walkouts, various demonstrations and stuff that were going on at the time, days of silence, in terms of like queer activism and stuff. It sort of was just, just one thing after the other. I wanted to get active in my union, so I started going to meetings, and then I heard about young workers being a thing, and I wanted to join the one at my union. We didn't have one, so I made it. And you just, one thing, one foot after the other, one day at a time. And then before you know it, you've been doing union activism for over 7 years now. One of the things that I did actually fairly early in my union activism, in 2016, I had my union march for the first time officially in Pride, the Pride March in New York City. And one of the things that is not so noticeable in and of itself. What is noticeable is that was the first IATSE Local that had ever done so. And so I think it's interesting to look at how far we've come as a child of the 90s, not knowing exactly what I was, queer, trans at the time, but knowing I was different and seeing, and it's surprising seeing how much of the rhetoric from the 90s that conservatives used to use against gay people has just been swapped with trans or just repeated verbatim.
Man, and I have so many questions, but I know we got to get to Jessica. But Faye, before we move on, I just wanted to hop back in and ask, for those of us who have literally like no clue like what that kind of work looks like, I was wondering if you could just say a little more about like what kind of operating that kind of equipment on like film sets, like what does that look like in your world on a week-to-week basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as a first AC, you're assigned to a camera, and generally they go A, B, C camera, down the line as many. Generally, most shows only have an A and B camera full time. Some shows have 3 cameras, but you're assigned to that camera. That's your camera. And as the focus puller, you're sort of in charge of making sure that you keep the camera in working order if anything needs to get replaced. But also, you're the one in charge of making sure that the lens is in focus. We use various wireless systems, and sometimes you just grab the lens with your hand, depending on what's going on. But we keep the image sharp. So we have to track and work with the camera operator, but also with the talent, whether it is a human actor or actress, or maybe a dog or some inanimate object, tabletop work product stuff. But with all those things moving on and with various filters and the lenses, we keep the image in focus, or sometimes not in focus for, creative or artistic purposes.
I have always been a gamer. Like, I remember getting my first console, which was a Nintendo 64, one Christmas. And I mean, I grew up as a middle child in a divorced home. So like video games was my babysitter for a while. Like, I would just sit on my console, and I remember used to like jiggle the N64 cartridge for Super Mario 64. And so it would like make Mario look funny, and like he would like melt into the ground. And I thought it was the funniest thing ever. So I always tried to break video games. And that was just like a theme that I had. Like, I always try to think outside of the box, like see if I can, do any kind of exploits. So gaming was a really community like sense for me, because when I would go to school, I would just like talk to my friends, and we'd all just be talking about gaming. And it was just like huge, like cultural thing for us growing up. And it like connected me to people. So I really always loved gaming. And then I remember I actually went to school for pharmacy technician before I got into game development, and realized that I had gone to school for pharmacy to just make minimum wage. And it was really unfortunate, because I like did so much work leading up to that. Right. And then I had a friend who was working at Activision at the time, working on Call of Duty Black Ops 3. In pre-alpha. And so they invited me over to their El Segundo office to like basically say, how passionate are you about video games? I'm very passionate about video games. How do you feel about breaking video games? That sounds wonderful to me. So I went into like a 3-day training for that, where they teach you like the technical terms of like what specific bugs are called and how to point them out and things like that. And then like how to write a really detailed good bug for a game. So after that, they like have like, it's like a trial period, like that 3-day period. And then at the end, you kind of like see if they'll put you on the floor. And so I made it on the floor. And I remember I actually was assigned night shift. So I like people were working on Call of Duty Black Ops 3 all around the clock. Like, it was insane, because we were doing old gen, which was Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 at the time. And then next gen, which was the newer consoles. So it was interesting. Like, we were broken up into a bunch of teams. I remember it was just insane. Like, at one point we were doing like 14-hour shifts to try to like get the crunch. Like, we needed to make our submission. We had people that were already pre-ordering. So it's like, we're very pushed to that release date. And then I just remembered, like, I remember when I joined, I was like, ooh, the pay is kind of low, right? Like, and they actually marketed it to me where it's like, yeah, it's kind of low starting, but you're going to make so much in overtime that like this hourly rate doesn't even matter. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And at the time I was kind of no life video gaming anyway. So to me, I was like, okay, cool. I get to just like game all night and, make, bug stuff and and make money. But it actually was really hard. Like, I just remember the politics of it. Like, everyone was really tired. Everyone wanted to like make it to the next round before layoffs. So there was a lot of like infighting. There was a lot of like rat race culture where people were like stealing bugs from each other and undercutting people, or like saying if they're like a minute or two longer on their breaks and things, or if they're like using their phone. It was really weird environment. And on the flip side of that, I actually made some lifelong connections working there, just because like, I think a lot of industries can relate to where it's almost like a trauma bond you have with your coworker. Like, you're both working through crappy conditions and you're just like trying to like get up and get ahead. And I've met some lifelong friends in the industry doing that as well. So it's like this double-sided coin of like, you get to work where you love, You get to work on really exciting projects, but you're definitely like your passion is exploited in that, like, okay, you're passionate, you want to work at video games. Well, this is what it takes. And then you kind of just like give yourself up for a few years and then you burn out. And I've seen that happen so many times in the industry where people just leave. A lot of people leave after the first like project that they ship just because they're so burned out. And it's just grueling. Like the overtime, the crunch culture, like crunch is so normalized in video games. I feel like lately we're getting away from it, but it was so normalized for a while that crunch was just a part of games. You just had to do it to get the game out on time. And it's weird to think about because it's like video games, you know, it's not like we're making software that's like saving lives. I mean, in a way we are, because like I said, with the community, you have that like sense of belonging to a community that you participate in, you like the games and stuff like that. So you really do give yourself to these projects. And it's almost like, depending on where you are in the company, it's definitely not given back to you unless you really, really fight for it. And there's a lot of people fighting for it at the same time. So,
man, yeah, I mean, like just the stories I've heard about crunch is just like, I don't know how you guys survived that shit, but it does seem
we definitely did
really intense. Well, and I wanted to just ask before we move on if you could talk a little bit about how that translated to game workers organizing and you being involved in that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so it's interesting the position that I was in when the state of California sued Activision-Blizzard for widespread harassment and discrimination, because when the news broke, Activision tried to paint it off as a Blizzard native issue, that it was only Blizzard that it was happening at. It doesn't happen at Activision. It doesn't happen anywhere else. And we fixed the problem. And I was working at Blizzard at the time. I had worked at Activision before, and that wasn't my experience. Like I knew that this was something that's just an industry problem. It's not an Activision problem. It's not a Blizzard problem. It's an everywhere problem, right? So I was like, that's not right. Like that literally feels like you're lying to us. You know, we need to take accountability. Like the big push and the reason why I joined the labor movement in games is because like I noticed none of these companies were taking accountability for the kinds of cultures that they create and foster. And they tried to like write it off, and that was a problem, right? Like it wasn't right. The reason I felt so empowered to join, because I was like tired of the facade of like, well, you work in games, you have to enjoy, like you work in games, you should be lucky to be here. There's like 5 people that would take your place if you leave right now type of like environment. And I wanted to make it better for the next generation of people, because like you should be okay to work on a project you're passionate about and not work yourself into like an early grave by like hurting yourself or doing these things that are just so mentally taxing, like physical exhaustion. It really does take a toll on people. It really does. Like I know a lot of people who have like sustained lifelong, repercussions of just those grueling hours and just lack of sleep, pushing yourself way too hard, people sleeping in the like under their desk or in their cars during breaks. It was just an actually wild concept to think about. It's like we're making video games, you know, it's not like health software. It's something that's supposed to be enjoyable. So like, why are we, kind of like squeezing all of that joy and passion out of people who genuinely care about the project and just not like, there was no return in that. People never like, it never showed anything, positive, just giving that much of yourself to the employer for them to then say, okay, thank you, the project's shipped and we're going to lay you off now. It just does not feel right. It's like this carrot on a stick dangling, you want to work in games? Well, you're going to have to work. And I definitely going in didn't anticipate it to be as intense as it was, but I definitely, it's just interesting the things that people accept because they want to work in a place that they're passionate about.
As the great Sarah Jaffe would say, work does not love you back, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. That was really enlightening and just heartbreaking, frankly. But man, again, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to get to chat to all of you. As listeners can hear, Fae, Jessica have such a tremendous wealth of experience working in different industries. And, you know, I just got so many questions that I want to ask y'all. And I would say, since we can't necessarily get into all of that here, I wanted to let listeners know that in the show notes for this episode, we're going to link to some other related interviews that we've done either here at Working People or that I've done at the Real News Network. If you want to learn more about the kind of work and organizing that Fae and Jessica do, we're going to link to a great interview that I got to do, including Fae, with them and other IATSE members during what was then we were quickly approaching a potential IATSE strike. It was averted in the 11th hour, but Fae and their coworkers talked more extensively in that episode about the kind of all the crazy work that goes on behind the scenes to make the film industry happen. And so I would highly recommend that folks check that interview out as well. And I mean, Jessica, I've been wanting to get Jessica on the show for a long time. And we're going to link to some reporting on the organizing campaign that Jessica was involved in. We'll also link to a recent interview that I did with James Russworm, who is the lead worker organizer for Canada's first video game worker union that formed in Edmonton and affiliated with the UFCW last year. So we'll link to all those in the show notes. Definitely go check them out. But as I said at the beginning of this episode, we want to, devote a good chunk of time here to talk about first, where the state of, the fight for LGBTQ rights is within the labor movement itself, right? So how far has the movement come on this issue, right? We talked last year with Martha Gravatt and Gabby Pierce about, how the labor movement has definitely not been the best on, fighting for LGBTQ plus rights in the past. That's not to say that every union, every local, acted as poorly or ignored these issues as much as others. But you can go back and hear, Martha describing, like how much of a slog it was just to sort of get, just like basic things like, benefits for domestic partners, right? And just even putting that on the radar of organized labor was such a slog, let alone fighting against discrimination on the job, so on and so forth. So we know that we've come a long way from there, but we still have a long way to go. And so before we kind of move on to talk about what role the labor movement is or needs to be playing in the larger fight for LGBTQ plus liberation, I want to go back around the panel and ask if y'all could just say a bit more about, from your vantage point and even from your own experience, how is the movement doing with, its support for LGBTQ plus workers? What are the kind of common issues and experiences that LGBTQ plus workers in the United States still have to deal with in the year of our Lord 2023 that maybe, their fellow workers who are straight and cis don't think about or don't see? I was wondering if we could just sort of talk about that first, looking inwards and talking about our own experiences on the job and within the movement. So Fae, I'm going to toss it back to you to start us off.
Yeah, it obviously, I think, depends obviously on each union or trade affiliation, and how that works. For example, a lot of health plans now do cover various aspects of transgender care, but they also don't cover various other aspects, and I think that is a very concrete and actionable thing. I think about these things because I'm on the Local 600 Health and Welfare Committee. And I think it's really important when we're talking about these issues, it is super important to not only be vocally supportive, but when we're talking about unions, we're talking about institutions. And institutions, something I say at union meetings fairly often, it's starting to become a mantra of mine, is, $5,000 in a union's coffer doesn't actually do that much material good to the union. But that $5,000 spent on a member could change that member's life. I'm specifically thinking of like medical debt and things like that. And I think that's really where unions can operate, because something that we've started to see, and I was afraid of this happening. Perfect example is when Starbucks was unionizing. Part of the reason that a lot of transgender people went to Starbucks to work there was because they did have a good health plan that did cover a lot of transgender care that for a lot of people might have been the only option that they could get their job that would cover it. And then once people started unionizing, Starbucks threatened to take that away. And that's where unions can really come in and not allow employers to use healthcare as a very powerful bludgeoning tool to, curb workers' rights and things like that.
I think the movement now, it's definitely built up a lot of momentum over the years I feel like there's a lot of parallels happening. So like the games industry is having its own kind of like revolutionary awakening in the labor space, because that really wasn't thought of before. And then you see like actors and writers and everyone kind of like at the same time are all kind of feeling this critical mass of like something needs to be done, right? Like it's just not like you have the UPS workers about to strike, like Teamsters, like there's so many areas of just labor in general that are reaching critical mass, I feel like. And the spot we're in now, it's interesting because at the same time, we're also having this like civil rights movement, because like we had the Black Lives Matter protests happened. And it was so beautiful to see people like true allyship, people using their privilege and their space in society to protect the people who are marginalized behind them. Like that was so wonderful to see. And you're seeing more of that now. And I think where we are with the LGBT, movement and labor, I think we need to see more of that allyship and the connection there. Because to me, allyship is like using your privilege to lift others that are marginalized and don't have the same equity and don't have that voice that you have. They're not going to listen to someone who they think is just complaining or they think is mentally ill or this or that. We need allyship more than ever. And one of the big initiatives that I pushed at ABK was allyship. And it was, because a lot of the time the burden is on the marginalized to teach the people who are privileged what it's like to be marginalized and what that means and like where our hurt and pain comes from. And then you have to look at it with that lens of like, these people are tired, these people are broken, they're constantly villainized in the media. And it's getting to another critical mass point where it's like they're being called horrible names. They're being like literally scapegoated in the media as like, just like the worst thing imaginable. And all of my friends and people that I know are LGBT are like the kindest, strongest, smartest, frankly, people that I even know. And it's just really sad to see them being targeted in this way that it almost feels like an unfair, like finger pointing of, you're what's wrong with society, when really all they want to do is push acceptance and love and, you are who you are, be who you are, and that's okay. And to even argue that that's something that's wrong or morally incorrect is just like unfathomable to me. So allyship is a huge thing I push for in any movement. Like, yes, realize that you do come from a place of privilege if you are privileged, and then use that privilege to help others who aren't privileged, because it's the only way we're going to build equity here. And that's a huge part of the labor movement as well. Like, as you know, labor movement, we all operate on solidarity, where like you and I don't necessarily want the same things, but we can both say that both of these are important and we should strive for better. We shouldn't, like just accept the status quo because it's not equitable. It's not going to like keep everyone happy. It's not going to be, it's not going to protect everybody, essentially. So like the way solidarity is like you can recognize that we're both two different people, but also at the end of the day, we're both workers. We both want, safe working conditions. And then we can apply this to the larger like civil rights movement of here's this group that's routinely disenfranchised, routinely bullied and scapegoated, and then just like use our power to lift those people up, because you might not be LGBT, but someone who is, and they are actively being targeted right now for wrong reasons. If any, I don't know if it's scapegoating, I don't know if it's like religious reasons, but at any rate, we need to protect our most marginalized communities, because if they are targeted and hurt, like an injury to one is an injury to all. Like who's to say they're not going to do it to you next, or any other group? They're just the easiest group to swing at right now, because there's a lot of like, religious bias and other biases. Like, frankly, people have a lot of unconscious bias that they walk around with and don't even realize it sometimes. And part of allyship is checking that unconscious bias and being actively proactive that you are wired a specific way. And then learning, what does it mean to be marginalized in this industry and in other industries, like Starbucks. They are, right now, they are striking over an unfair labor practice where they're like forced to remove pride, like pride flags and things from their stores. And that's huge. Like that's such they're using their power, their bargaining power collectively to say this is wrong and the company should make a stance on this. And that's what's important, because it's really easy to be passive and just say, yes, we care about our LGBT employees, but then showing up and saying like, this is not okay, and doing action is where you're going to really see that push go even further.
Oh yeah, and no, I'm really glad you mentioned the Starbucks workers, because I think that's a huge part of this story. I mean, Starbucks itself as a company has profited handsomely over the years by pretending that it is this progressive, inclusive brand, and yet it is the same company that is union busting scorched earth with a workforce that has a lot of queer and trans workers in it, many of whom depend on the healthcare benefits that Starbucks provides for gender affirming care, so on and so forth. And I think that, like that, you're right, Jessica, that's a really, really important kind of convergence, right, of the civil rights and labor side of things, and showing how powerful they can be together and why we all need to be supportive of that and stand in solidarity with them. And before we kind of get to the final turn here, I wanted to just follow up on something with you, Jessica, if I could, because I feel like this is a whole other podcast conversation, but like a lot of that like fascist far right bullshit that we are seeing today that you and Faye describe, the vicious, hateful, violent attacks against queer and trans people in this country, scapegoating them as the source of all of society's ills, using these really hateful terms like groomer to try to turn the public against them. It's really, really disgusting, but also like a lot of that runs through your industry. Like a lot of that, not all of it, but like a lot of the far right kind of weirdness that has culminated in the radical far right movements we're seeing today. A lot of them have kind of connections to Gamergate, to the, intense sexism in the video game industry from the player side as well as the industry side. So I wanted to just ask if you could talk a little bit about that, about how queer and trans workers like in this space, or even like gamers in this space, like how that, I guess, is sort of connected to the conditions that you work and organize in this industry.
No, that's a good point. And it's interesting because I feel like for a long time, we kind of just collectively ignored a lot of the toxicity in the gaming space. And, I mean, I'm a woman in games. I pretty much went in knowing that it was a male dominated field and that I was going to have to pretty much grind my way to the top or if I wanted to get anywhere. And I consider myself very stubborn in that, like, I don't want to leave the industry because I want to leave it in a better spot than before I found it. And there's definitely a lot of like boys club, and it's why you saw the lawsuit at Riot and why you saw the lawsuit at Blizzard. And it's because there's this culture that is just allowed to continue. Like, people make jokes and then nobody calls it out. It's like how the BLM movement framed it as like, it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be effectively anti-racist. And I think we need to get to that space in games where it's like, it's not okay to be, it's okay to be non-misogynistic, but like, you need to be actively calling out bad behaviors in your space, because then that leads to a cultural thing of setting the precedent that this isn't accepted or tolerated here, and this isn't okay. And I feel like a lot of the companies are very passive, and with games especially, like if you notice, I'm sure you're on Twitter, there are just constant harassment campaigns against developers, and especially LGBT developers. Gamers will actively go out of their way to try and harm developers because they don't like a video game, because something some change happened that the developer didn't even have anything to do with, but because they're a developer, they get the target of that rage. And even like in something like a Call of Duty lobby, like you hear like, oh, you wouldn't last 2 minutes in a Call of Duty lobby. It's because we allow bad behaviors. We allow people to be abusive. We allow, and we don't condemn actively those things, because why? Well, at the end of the day, bottom line is what's more important to these companies. The bottom line, the end user, we want everyone to play our games. Okay. But you also have to realize that there are groups that are horribly like treated in the industry and need that, like, they need to know that people are going to at least be aware of the injustices that are happening and try to work against that, right? And that's why we did a huge push at ABK for our leadership to say something in, to say that we believe victims when they come forward and tell us about abuse, not to say that that doesn't happen here, because then you're effectively discrediting anyone who's come forward. And there's a lawsuit for a reason. There's enough evidence collected to go forward for a reason. You need to actively say, yes, this is wrong, and we're working to correct that, versus it doesn't happen here. So then it's like this thing of like discrediting the victim is always something you hear, like Gamergate, everything. When stuff comes out, they go to character assassination of the person who reported the issue, versus like, okay, let's look at the bigger picture of what this problem is and why it keeps manifesting in our spaces. It's because we're actively not anti-misogynistic or anti, prejudice. There's just so, and like, even it's just hard. It's hard because when I think companies are afraid to make that precedent, because it's kind of like an admission of guilt, of complacency. Like, we've been complacent for so long that I feel like if they were to come out now, people would just then make a mockery of it and say like, oh, well, where was this, years ago? And I think we need to just collectively agree that it's okay to feel two things at the same time. Like, we can like a game and hate its community or hate the way that they treat developers, and use that solidarity, like class solidarity. I feel like we could all pretty much, you're not a game developer. There's people that aren't game developers. At the end of the day, we're all just people trying to get by, make a living, and work and be protected while we're working. And I feel like people can resonate with that wherever they work, right? But I think this problem is a larger symptom of like a cultural issue where we are not actively calling out injustices as much as we should be, or trying to like mitigate those things. I think we're just so passive in that space, like in gaming in general. We don't care. We just want to play video games. Like, when the ABK stuff started, a lot of people in my comments were actually like, I don't care. Where's the new Call of Duty map? And it's like, okay, I get it. I also love Call of Duty and love the maps and love working on the game. But let me give you a real hard reality check that like, hey, guess what? If the developers that are creating your video games are literally working themselves to death, you're not going to get a good video game. And, you want the people that are passionately in love with creating these games to be treated ethically if you want a game that is good and can be ethically consumed, and that's what a lot of the movement is doing to show. I feel like we've shown a lot of gamers and people that are in the community, that kind of treatment that's been going on in the industry since the Riot lawsuit, since the Blizzard lawsuit. I feel like now it's more shown. But back then it was like, oh, we don't know how to make video games. It's like this huge mystery. And now we're kind of showing it. And hopefully all I can say is like, we're already kind of seeing a really huge labor push in games. And I think it's just going to keep continuing to grow. And as long as we're collectively and like calling out, bad labor practices and continuing on, it's just going to get better from here on out. So.
Hell yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for laying all of that out. I want to, with the time we have remaining, sort of zoom out a bit and kind of take the bird's eye view here. All right. Because as I did my best to lay out in the introduction to this episode, right? And as folks listening to this surely know themselves, as you know all too well, we are in a very, very dark period in this country's history. It's sad, it's infuriating, it's terrifying. It's all of these things at once, right? I have admitted many times on this show that I grew up very conservative and believed a lot of the conservative rhetoric when I was growing up in the 90s and early aughts. Thankfully I kind of made my long ideological journey to seeing the world the way that I see it now by talking to folks like yourselves over and over again, by deprogramming a lot of that bigoted hate and just all of this kind of just like all this crap, all this ideological junk that is stuffed into our heads from the time that we're kids. We're taught to, see difference as a bad thing, right? And to judge people for not looking like or acting like us. And to just, respond with, at best, callousness and at worst, just pure cruelty towards our fellow human beings, even people within our own family. The ways that people turn that hatred outward and push it onto others. That they excommunicate members of their own family for, not being, the person that the parents thought that they were, quote unquote. People can get fired in this country in most states for no cause at all, right? And so, of course, if people are gay or trans or any number of things, like you can't legally be discriminated against based on your identity. But as we know, as we document all the time on this show, bosses are going to find any excuse that they want to justify firing people or retaliating against people. So, of course, that shit happens all the time in the American workplace, and we should not kid ourselves and pretend that it doesn't. But again, I just kind of, really want us to sort of take stock of where we are right now in this country. And it's not staying in this country, right? I think the other thing to note is that the kind of right-wing politics that we're seeing here, and this is what I meant by mentioning that I grew up conservative, is I'm just seeing so much of the same bullshit that I was hearing in the 90s, all the kind of manufactured panic over, the children. We've got to save the children, and we've got to, eliminate this sector of society to save the children. We can't let gay people near our children. We can't let trans people near our children. We can't let drag story hour, exist because, heaven forbid, a child sees a person in drag. All the while, our kids are getting slaughtered by, assault rifles in their own schools. They're getting, the climate is going to be uninhabitable for many of them by the time they reach adulthood, depending on where in the world that they live. None of that's a fucking concern, right? But, heaven forbid, our precious children learn about the fact that there are more than just one type of person out there in the world. Anyway, I'm just I want to kind of focus on that, right? I want to talk about where we are right now, why this is happening, this fascistic genocidal attack to either push LGBTQ plus people back into the closet or to push them out of existence, and what the labor movement needs to be doing and what all of us need to be doing to fight against that. So I want to just, one more time go around the table. To our panelists, please take this in whatever direction you want. But yeah, can we talk about what role the movement needs to be playing in the larger fight for LGBTQ plus liberation? What people listening to this, what we and our coworkers and our neighbors can do to be part of that fight, and why we need to be part of that fight.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about what you were saying about with how things people used to say in the '90s, and it is exactly like what you said. You know, I'm an Eagle Scout. I heard all of those things. It's wild what people will say around you when they don't know what you are. But like I remember that stuff. But it's wild to see how much it's been repackaged and turned, just with gay swap for trans, or sometimes not even, like you were saying, verbatim. But I think part of the reasons that it is so drastic is that conservatives did see what happened in the 90s and the aughts with gay rights, and they just lost. They lost hard. So I think part of why it's so vile and vehement and so full of hate this time around, and I do feel this way, is that if they don't get rid of us, either kill us, put us back in the closet, remove us from public life, they're going to lose, and they're going to lose soon, which is why so much of this stuff is so drastic. But it's so rushed. You look at the Arkansas trans healthcare ban got struck down federally because it was so broad. It was obviously unconstitutional. And, I think that's the thing that I am personally looking at, is that this is a hard fight, and we are not, I am not someone that believes history will always move in the progress. No, history moves in ways who fights. That's how it moves. It is not going to necessarily be progress unless we make that be the future that happens. And, with that, I think the things that not only can unions do institutionally, because I think, in a lot of ways outside of queer organizations, unions are one of the few institutions that does have a vested interest in supporting their members. And every union, I don't know a union that, unless it's one person who happens to be straight, and that's not a union, that's one person, doesn't have queer membership of some variety. And what's so important, and this is so key to why conservatives lost the gay rights fight, was people started coming out and knowing other queer people. And it wasn't just that, I have a gay best friend, or, that cliche line. But what it was in conversations where that person who was out wasn't in, there would be straight people would say something homophobic, and a straight friend would go, hey, cut that out. And that's what we need to do, because there's not enough trans people to be in every single conversation. There's not enough queer people even to be in every single conversation. And what we need is people to just go, hey, cut that out. And that will do so much, in my personal opinion.
I mean, it's no surprise that there's a lot of rise of like fascist policies in the United States. I feel like with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then, the continuous targeting of LGBT people, it's just getting worse and worse. And for the first time ever, there was an alert for like safety reasons of LGBT people in the United States, which, I mean, I always thought the United States was more progressive in that, space. And it's just really horrible to see that it almost feels like a grift. Like the right will attach themselves to anything that they can use to put on a huge charade of, oh my God, look at all this horrible stuff that's going on that's not even real, but they can like drum up enough support to radicalize like and mobilize people. And that's all the right is doing right now, I feel, is just like mobilizing like people, misaligning them around this thing that's not even real, like that doesn't exist. Like people are like the thing that they chose to affix themselves to at first was like drag shows. And they are pushing like propaganda and things that aren't even real and true, but because they use such a like catching, like it's almost like a hook, like they use a hook saying like LGBT people are doing this and this is why you should care about it. And it's horrible. And any rational person being told that this is what's happening would think, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Of course I'm going to like it then radicalizes them to join the movement, right? And that's the problem, is that it's misinformed. It's this like horrible, over dramatic, like overplayed thing that's not even real about LGBT people, that they're just trying to prey on people and turn people a specific way, when really it is all that movement is about is saying it's okay to be who you are. And you know, I think what it is there is a critical mass in labor and there's a critical mass in civil rights right now, where people are continually being hurt, continually being scapegoated, continually being pushed to the side, and rights are taken away from them. And then those people react, and then the right says, look at these people reacting, look at how bad they're being. And it's kind of like a reactive abuse situation. It's like you're going to continue to take the abuse and the abuse and the abuse. And once you stand up against the abuse, then they're saying you're being abusive. And it's really sad to see, but also at the same time, it's good that like we're calling it out, because I feel like for a while, it's just felt like, oh, you know, LGBT people are accepted and we have Pride Month and it's fine. It really isn't fine. You know, we definitely have Pride Month, and I've been like in the Gay Straight Alliance since like high school. It's definitely a big part of my like civil rights activism, is like pushing for more ethical treatment of LGBT youth, especially. And to see them targeted in this way is just so sad. It's not something I've seen in you know, my years of activism in the space. And my fear is that people are just going to see what's happening and say like, they've got it, it's fine, they've dealt with this kind of stuff for years. But they aren't seeing like the seriousness of the accusations that are being pushed and the narrative that's being pushed. And it's weird. It almost feels like, what's the bigger picture? Like, why are they pushing so hard for these things, right? Like Roe v. Wade, for example, criminalizing abortion, you know, criminalizing homosexuality. It's almost as if they're like, they want to force the status quo so badly. Like they need more poor workers or more, you know, broken homes and people having children that, you know, they have no business having, and things like that, so that it can keep the status quo. And it almost feels like they're doing any extreme measures possible to keep the status quo. And that's why you're seeing these things. And now it's reaching a critical mass. And we need the people to just unify, come together, and use their allyship. Like allyship, what the labor movement can do right now is recognize your privilege, use your allyship to help the people that are not privileged, to help the people that are regularly attacked in the community. Like that's what true allyship is. And I feel like when we get to that collective allyship of, yeah, we know solidarity, right? Solidarity is a great thing in the labor movement, in the industry. Let's move that into allyship and really nurture that solidarity into something that's like proactively making those actions to help those that are, you know, in lower places than we are and don't have the means to protect themselves and are like getting their civil rights taken away, frankly, because it's like, you know, now women's autonomy is removed. Like it's weird to think that when I was born, I had more rights than I did now. You know, like now it's like abortion is illegal, and you know they're trying to criminalize homosexuality and transgenderism. And it's just really sad to see. And I wish that I don't know. I wish that we were more accepting. And I always felt like, you know, in the United States, we were pretty progressive, but for like the last few years, it feels almost like a regression in that space. And I think, you know, as long as we're all collectively noticing and putting actions against, then we're going to fight it. But, you know, it's the scariness of the fascism and the right wing's boogeyman, and how easy that is to radicalize people, that it makes it really difficult. But as long as we're calling out the grift and we're calling out people that are doing these things to incite hatred and to like enforce the status quo and keep people below where they are, we'll be okay and in a good spot to fight against it. But it is definitely something that we have to work on.
The point you made, about like having more rights when you were born than we do now, like that was real. Like that sent like a chill down my spine.
Yeah, it's weird to think like my mother had more rights as a you know, woman that could have an abortion at her age, right? Like it's weird to think about that in 2023. This is stuff we're worrying about, right? Like this is already something that was decided by the Supreme Court is a civil right, and now it's reversed, and yeah, it's really weird. The climate that we're at now, like I keep saying critical mass, and it really does feel like we're there. Like, I guess what happens after that, a revolution, maybe, I don't know.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Right. It's just to that point. Like, and I took a sociology class in college, and I specifically remember my professor saying, like, we are in a post-industrialized society. We've all just kind of been going with the status quo for so long. And we really need a revolution for workers' rights to not like regress to where they were, you know, before. And it's like, it's weird to think about because like people literally fought and died for 40-hour work weeks, for non-child labor. And then you're seeing these stories come out about like child labor, like children are working in factories and, oh my gosh, like it's the grind set. I work 80 hours a week and things like that. And it's like, where did we get to this spot? Like we know people bled and you know, lost so much to even give us these protections, like all like the OSHA and everything, it's all written in blood, right? Like all of those protections. And then how easily it is to just like walk that back by a culture of a grind set or like, you know, and it's weird to think about because like I have nothing in common with a billionaire, but they're so like in society, they're looked at as like the pinnacle of the human experience. Like, oh, wow, I could be a billionaire, but there's literally no chance of that happening. And I think people will believe that because it can happen, it's a good thing. And it's okay if like a small percentage of the world has this amount of wealth, right? Because it could be me one day, but really it's just not, that's not going to happen.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, I think it's like, and I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be made there about, you know, people telling us that we're being unrealistic about wanting to save the planet and humanity from climate chaos or transition away from capitalism. And people are like, oh, that'll never happen. It's like, well, you fucking believe you're going to be a billionaire. That's more magical thinking than this is. So maybe we're actually closer to where we need to be than we think. Exactly.
It's so weird too. And something else I wanted to mention is like when we were pushing our ABK stuff. So Activision-Blizzard-King has offices all over the United States and even global, right? So we're in, you know, our work communication tool Slack. We have everyone across ABK in Slack. I remember we were pushing for, you know, ethical treatment of people in video games. Like, why is crunch culture so bad? And our allies in other countries were actually amazed at the sentiment that was being expressed from US workers. Like they were actually like, it's so anti like worker, like the way that y'all speak about your conditions, it's framed in the way that like you should be lucky to be working here. And like, yeah, I worked this much, but I love what I do. And it's like, yeah, you can love what you do, but also recognize that this is unscalable at this. You know, you can't just work yourself to death for like 20 years and then expect everything to be okay. And then our boss is making like $200 million a year and laying off all of our French workers, you know, because they're unionized. And like, there's just so much that people are actively ignoring because they just think that, oh, well, you know, the bosses know what they're doing. But it's always about the bottom line, like always about the bottom line. And there's a human cost every time.